Our stay at the lake during the summer of 2005 was both shorter than usual and hotter than normal. That said, there were plenty of typical lake experiences, such as the scene you see, that made for very good moments indeed. Much of what we do during the summer at the lake can be classified as typical. However, every summer has its share of distinguishing features, and 2005 was no exception. For the first time in many years, Anne and I had a dog at the lake. The previous fall, we had become the caretakers of Anne's dad's 17-year-old dog, Sophia. Being that old and with most of the age-related infirmities, you might say that Sophia requires special care. We were wondering how she would do at the lake, but she did just fine. As you can see, she has not lost her interest in a well-stocked cupboard. The garden turned out to be perfect for Sophia. She could wander the paths and still be in an enclosed area. She did not like boats very well, which made for some interesting trips to town. Our deer fence had held the previous winter, so Anne's garden really started to take the shape she had envisioned. The bushes that were intended to provide verticals actually did that this year. The perennials, which were 2 or more weeks late blooming last year, were right on schedule. We also planted lots of seeds, which did quite well. The floating dock you see was purchased in the late 1980s. With time, the styrofoam blocks, which provided flotation, deteriorated and became saturated to the point where if more than 2 people got on the dock, someone got their feet wet. It's not easy to get new floats under a heavy dock. We thought about it for a long time before proceeding. We decided to take advantage of the high water and skid the dock with a block and tackle up on the rock at Internet Point. We could then jack it up and install the new floats. We had to get the old floats out before the dock would skid, but we managed by hook or by crook. Hydraulic jacks are wonderful things. They allow one to raise heavy objects with relative ease. We jacked up each side one at a time to install a line of floats the whole 16-foot length. It was necessary to add some supports underneath as the new floats were sized differently than the old. Although the picture shows Dave doing the work, the efforts of the photographer were crucial to the success of this project. With the new floats installed, it was easy to skid the dock back into the water. As you can see, it floats much higher now. To put the dock back in service, all we had to do was reconnect it to the bridge leading up from shore. The final touch was to rebuild the swimming ladder and attach it to the dock. A much anticipated project was complete. During the summer of 2004, we had done quite a bit of work on our dining room. We added a number of windows, completed insulating and paneling, installed a small wood stove, and relocated the bathroom, in the process installing a composting toilet. The valances you see were new this year. And see that window sash in the corner? That was earmarked for the bathroom, but didn't quite get installed last summer. It is now in place and provides needed light for that room. Our most enduring memory of the summer of 2005 has to do with this large red pine tree. We have many pictures of the evening sun shining on the top of this tree. It's always been, like so many things in life, a mixture of majesty and menace. The majesty you can see. Although you can't tell it from the picture, the menace comes from its location 15 or so feet from the cabin. Each summer has its share of thunderstorms and even more warnings that severe storms could develop. This picture looks southwest and shows one such storm approaching. The afternoon of June 23rd was extremely hot and muggy, but the weatherman had promised relief from a strong cold front to arrive soon. He also warned that severe thunderstorms could develop, and indeed, we watched the skies in the southwest darken late in the afternoon. We would have a storm. When it arrived, it soon became apparent that it was indeed severe. The balsams were bending nearly horizontal. As we moved to a more protected part of the cabin, we heard a loud thump. Something had hit on the cabin roof. We looked into the living room at the ceiling, and this is what we saw. Branches from the tree were poking through. It had gone over in the storm. The storm was still raging, and we could see trees bending and breaking all around us. We tried to stay out from directly under where our tree was on the roof and hope for the best. These storms usually last for minutes rather than hours, and such was the case with this one. We were soon able to better assess just what it is we were dealing with. A look out our living room window shows our new relationship to the tree. We had had a direct hit. Is our roof that strong? Why didn't it crash all the way through? This picture shows why we still have a cabin. The tree uprooted and didn't crack off. It was growing in no more than a foot of soil. The roots nearest us in the photo either pulled out or cracked off. The ones nearest the cabin bent without breaking and served to hold up some of the weight of the tree, preventing it from pulverizing our little cabin. As we looked at the tree from the back of the cabin, we could see that not very many of its branches actually struck the roof. Most were still in the air, but now they were over the roof and right over our bedroom. We decided to sleep in the guest house that night. You can see that the top branches tangled with the chimney pipe for our new stove. We found the cap on the ground, but not so dented that it could not be reinstalled. By the time this picture was taken, we were of course thinking about how we were going to get that tree off the roof. It was clear that we would have to start from the top and work down. The first step would be to cut some of the top branches with a chainsaw while standing on the roof. One problem with this idea was that our usually reliable saw was being temperamental. We called Dave and Jan Hill to see how they had fared, tell them what had happened, and asked to borrow their chainsaw. They would come in the morning with the saw to see the tree. We retired to the guest house for the night. June 24, dawn clear and cool, perfect for removing a tree from one's cabin. Dave and Jan arrived early and agreed that it was a big tree. After looking things over, Ann suggested that she cut a bunch of flowers for them to take home. Jan said they were not going just yet. They were here to help, and help they did. You will see them in pictures from the beginning to the end of the removal process. Their hard work and timely suggestions were invaluable. You see Dave and me on the roof removing some branches. The Hills had told the Lockwoods about our predicament. They have Hall's old property on the other side of Middle Island. Gary and Marilyn stopped on their way to town to view the tree. One look and Gary said, "I'm going to go get Terry." Terry being Terry Lenny, a Scotty Island neighbor who is retired from the MNR. He has had a lot of experience with trees and would be able to give us good advice on how to proceed. The Lockwoods returned saying that the Lennys also had business in town that day, but that Terry would come over after they returned. In the meantime, Dave and I kept working away at the limbs. Each limb we cut had to be lowered carefully so that it did not do any more damage to the roof. I had promised Ann that I would not climb in the tree. Dave did venture up a ways, but the chainsaw proved too unwieldy, so we could use it only on branches we could reach standing on the roof. We used various different saws for the higher branches, which were surprisingly heavy. Our work was beginning to lighten the load on the cabin. The problem of what to do with all the branches Dave and I were cutting was solved by Ann and Jan. As soon as the branch would hit the ground, they clipped it into smaller bits and then hauled the parts off to various piles to either be ground for mulch or cut into lengths for firewood. There are 2 window boxes in this picture sitting on the picnic benches. These we had taken down from their supports under the dining room windows. The branches were coming right down by these windows. It's hard to overemphasize what having all the branches clipped, sorted, and moved meant to the project. The next half dozen pictures show the methods we used to remove branches that were over our heads. Here Dave is using a piece of saw chain with ropes tied to either end. You throw one end of the rope over the limb with the help of a weighted bag. After positioning the chain on the limb, you rock it back and forth by alternately pulling on the 2 ropes. This back and forth motion tires the arms, but one can cut a fairly large branch in a reasonable amount of time. We took turns. I think Dave's favorite was his pole saw, which is basically a saw blade on the end of a pole. What you can reach with a pole, you can saw, and it's less tiring than the rope saw. We used ropes to keep the heavier branches from striking the roof as we sawed them off. Ample early summer rains made for very heavy branches. Roping was crucial. We did have to make sure that we did not cut through the rope along with the branch. Here I'm using clippers to take some weight off a particularly large branch before we dropped it to the ground. By mid-afternoon, we'd done all we could without climbing the tree. Out our front door, the tree looked like this. You can see that we had removed quite a few branches. The tree had raised just a bit off the roof. There were still some branches poking through, however. The topmost branches were beyond our reach. Someone would have to climb the tree with a saw. We were hoping that Terry Lunny would have some suggestions. He arrived late afternoon as promised. He thought we had made good progress and observed that the tree should spring back quite a bit more as weight was removed from the top, and might even straighten up again. That was encouraging because I was concerned about trying to chunk the tree in small lengths all the way down. When I asked if he knew anyone whom we might hire to climb the tree, he said he would do it. He would be back in the morning with saws. We headed for our second night in the guest house, but not before dropping over to the hills for a dinner of Italian wedding soup. After all their work, cooking us a dinner was above and beyond. But as Anne said in her lake journal for June 25th, when Dave asks you to come and eat something he has cooked, you go. Terry arrived early on June 25th, another clear, relatively cool day. Jan and Dave returned to help some more and see an expert work. Where possible, Terry used his Swede saw. It's quieter than the chainsaw and easier to handle. Many branches we could just catch as they were cut off. The next three pictures show Terry at work with his Swede saw. Luckily, we had left stubs for him to get a foothold on. We needed to saw up some branches before we could safely throw them down. Time to go a little higher. As the branches came off, the tree was showing signs of raising off the roof. There was the possibility that the tree would right itself at any time, and Terry did not want to be in it if it did. We essentially tied the tree down with a rope and a come-along to the spruce tree on the left in the picture. We roped the topmost branches down, as they had too far to fall when cut off. The cleanup well in hand, Jen looks at the progress. Almost a clean trunk, but that last one is up there a ways. The branch is free, but the rope is tangled. It's time to start taking chunks of the trunk, starting at the top. A little rest before that step. As you can see, only the trunk remains, but cutting chunks off the top is not trivial. The trunk is thicker than the branches Terry has been cutting. It's time for the chainsaw. The tree is no longer on the roof, but I think you'll agree it's still a menace. About this time, the bay filled with pelicans and cormorants. I think they just wanted to see what was going on. This shows Terry with his chainsaw on a fairly large chunk of trunk. The chunk he cut had to be roped down. He never even nicked any of the various ropes we had in place. You can see that after this chunk was down, we had to loosen the hold down rope. The rope is loose and the tree has come up, but it certainly didn't right itself. We tied this rope near the top of the tree so we would have some way of helping the tree to an upright position. Pushing with a 2x4 raised it some. The root ball is still as high as Jan's head. The roof damage looks repairable with the tree well off of it. However, the tree still looms over the cabin. Part of the root ball had curled under. If we wanted to straighten the tree up, we had to dig away that curled part. We used both a block and tackle and a come-along to winch the tree upright again. It's coming up. A bit farther. We did it. It is straight up again. I suppose at this stage of the game, one option would have been to make some sort of totem pole out of the tree. But when Terry asked if I would feel better if we took it down, I answered yes, I would. There was only one place the tree could fall without threatening other buildings, and that was down the path that leads to the woodshed. As the tree still leaned a bit towards the cabin, we positioned both block and tackle and come along in that direction. Dave and I would pull like mad while Terry made the necessary cut. Here he is working on the notch that points in the direction of the fall. Still notching. Notice the hole about 6 feet up? I've seen squirrels in there. The back cut at an angle. It still leans back towards the cabin. Keep those winches going. She is now going where we want, away from the cabin and down the path. Dave and I are taking up the slack as fast as we can. The tree is no longer a menace to the cabin. It's on the ground. Dave makes sure it stays down. Jan is examining the stump, which has a large rotten spot in the middle. Years ago I was told, I think by Berger Anderson, that many of the pines growing near the water have these rotten spots. When the islands were lumbered more than 100 years ago, the loggers left those near the water because of these rotten centers. The trees don't know they have a problem and live on for many years. Terry volunteered to cut the trunk into manageable lengths. Dave and I had visions of making planks and thought 4-foot lengths was about what we could handle, so Terry obliged. Every part of that tree will be used in some way. The needles and small branches go into the chipper shredder and come out as mulch for the garden and paths. The larger branches serve as firewood, as does a good part of the trunk. I got an Alaskan sawmill for the chainsaw for my birthday. Dave and I later cut one of the 4-foot logs into about a dozen 1-inch planks that are now seasoning in his workshop. Less than 48 hours after the storm, the tree was off the cabin. All parts of it were cut up and organized. There is no way this could have happened without the help of our neighbors and friends. The weather the next day, June 26th, was also good, but there was rain forecast for that night. I thought it best to get the holes repaired during the day. Back in 1973, when Ann and I built our original cabin, we used shiplap boards on 2x4 rafters. We were lucky in a way. The 3 or 4 branches that pierced the roof went through between the rafters, which proved to be intact. I was able to find enough shiplap boards to replace those that had cracked, and there were enough red shingles stored from previous roofing jobs to complete the repairs. Thus completes the highlights of the summer of 2005 at the lake. I should note that while Ann and I were back in Bloomington for a couple of weeks, A. Rene was not empty. The Hossers and the Gehrmans were there and managed a number of highlights of their own. I'm not qualified to comment on those. The picture is a sunset that closed one of our days. We use it to close this recounting of the highlights of the summer of 2005 at the lake.